Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the tariff briefing we have. My name is Erin Berry. I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for Merit Medical Systems, and I've been asked to facilitate today's conversation. This weekly briefing is hosted by the Salt Lake Chamber and the World Trade Center Utah, and is designed to keep you updated on the latest tariff and trade developments. Our first presenter is Ben Kolendar. He's the Chief of Staff for World Trade Center Utah. He will give us an update on any changes to the WTC Utah's tariff dashboard and provide insight into the ever-changing global landscape. After Ben, we will hear from Duncan Glenn. He's Director of Professional Services for B10 Energy. He will discuss the basics of the duty drawback tool and highlight how it relates to the new current tariffs. As a reminder, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A function at any time. We will do our best to answer them as they come in. And this session is being recorded and will be available on the Chamber's website if you'd like to revisit it or share it with any colleagues. With that, let's get started. Ben, take it away.
Thanks, Erin. Good to be here again with everyone. We're going to be pretty quick on the tariff updates this week. I'm going to share my screen and share the tariff dashboard with everyone. All right, so we'll start from the tariff dashboard. So if you aren't aware, if this is your first time joining, to access the tariff dashboard, you could just go to our website at wtcutah.com/tariffs, and you could see all of the latest actions by tariff item. And you can scroll down. So if there's a tariff in particular you're concerned about, it's got all the associating documentation, details about what regions are impacted and what goods are being targeted with any tariff action. So the major updates I want to focus on this morning, there was an announcement around autos. So for any chamber members, World Trade Center Utah members, or other companies joining us who are involved in autos, there was an action taken on April 29th by the president to basically alleviate some of the tariff layering that takes place with the tariff. So there was an exemption on the 232 tariffs that overlay with the auto tariffs. And then there was a second action that basically reduces some of the costs of tariffs for cars assembled in the US. And it's a little bit of a complex formula, but for 2025 to 2026, if 15% of the cars are made in the US, you could get a 3.75% offset, and there's some paperwork and other things associated with that. And for cars made with 10% content, you could get a 2.5% offset between 2026 and 2027. So without going into too many of those details, the point is that the actions taking place on April 29th were meant to alleviate some of the tariff layering and impacts of tariffs on autos. So I'm also going to go into, and you can see that on our tariff dashboard as the second line down on automobiles and automobile parts. The second thing I'd like to go into is just maybe updates. So things that aren't any new announcements, but things that have been in process and steps are happening behind the scenes, because sometimes that could be just as confusing for other folks as new announcements and what that means. So for those of you who are not tracking the de minimis closure for products coming from China and Hong Kong, this is the top item on our tariff dashboard. Those items went into effect at midnight. So at 12:01 this morning, de minimis went into effect, and all the documents, if anybody has any technical questions, either for their legal team, they could share this link and they could go in and have pretty quick resources to go find some of the customs language or the executive order language. It's great for your attorneys or supply chain experts to see that. So the de minimis went into effect at midnight tonight. Auto parts, so different from autos, auto parts, which is a part of the same executive order, but they had different implementation timelines. The tariffs on auto parts go into effect tonight, well, at midnight tonight, so 12:01 a.m. on May 3rd. And the last thing is we have some of the 232, so the national security tariffs that are specifically focused on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. So these two right here, if you could see my screen, those are coming to public comment close next week. So if you're involved in those industries, you're highly encouraged to take a look at those and provide any public comment that would be helpful when the federal government's considering this, any tariffs that will come from the studies. So we're tracking the typical timeline on tariff implementation for 232s are, at least 270 days, because that's a timeline that the government sets forth. We don't know when the public comment closes between that period and announcement of tariffs. We don't know what that back end is going to look like because it's the maximum, not the minimum, but normally it comes in around the maximum. So if quick action is taken right after public comment closes, we're looking at anywhere from later next week into sometime in December for tariffs to take place. So we'll continue to monitor what those 232 tariffs look like and keep this group informed as well. So those are our major updates for the week. Thanks, Erin, and don't want to take up too much time so that
before we Ben, before we kick it over to Duncan, there was a question that came in that perhaps you could answer quickly.
Sure.
It's from Blake. He says, my research suggests that all reciprocal tariffs will go back into effect around July 9th, regardless of ship date, but I haven't seen much official confirmation. Is that accurate? Or will there be a similar ship date clause withdrawn for consumption on a final mode of transport as there was at first implementation?
Oh, so that's a great question. So we're tracking July 8th on our dashboard, but the question is, can you go into that again, specifically on mode of transit?
Will there be a similar ship date clause withdrawn for consumption on a final mode of transport as there was at first implementation?
That's an interesting question. Maybe we could go back and reference in between this meeting and the next one what's happened in the past on other pauses, but typically you find this out in the CSMS when that's released. It'll have those details contained in there. So you couldn't say with certainty until that comes out, and it normally comes out a few days before. Sometimes you get it a week before, but that's going to be where you could go to for that specific language on what the enforcement is going to look like. So until that comes out, you won't know for certain, but we can make an educated guess and do a little digging between now and the next meeting.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Let's have Duncan take over.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll just share my screen and wanted to go over some of the basics of duty drawback, just to kind of start off here. And, when we think big picture, duty drawback is something that it's been available for like ever, but recently it's kind of important to consider it with all these new tariffs that have come up with the Trump administration, because not all of them are drawback eligible, but a good handful are drawback eligible. And so, just with the increasing costs across the board, could be a good opportunity to evaluate whether drawback makes sense for you and your company. Okay. So here's an overview. The basic premise of drawback is whenever you pay duties on goods that are imported into the US, but you don't end up consuming them in the US, in other words, you want to export them, perhaps you want to do some manufacturing on them and then export, regardless of what you're doing, as long as they get exported, you shouldn't have to pay duties on those goods in theory, right? Because the whole point of duties for goods coming into the US is kind of the cost of doing business in the US economy. If you don't intend for those goods to be used here, then you should be able to get those duties back. And I'm not sure why it is, but it's only, I mean, it's 99% that you can get back. I don't know why they didn't just do 100%, but and then this right here, the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. It's pretty massive, but there's a specific part 190 there that covers everything drawback related. And that's kind of the governing literature for all things drawback. There's a few different types. First, there's a manufacturing drawback. And there's a lot of nuance here, but essentially if you're taking a raw material or some product that's not in its final state of use and you're performing a substantial change to it in the US, if you end up exporting that finished product, that can be eligible for drawback. Another one is unused merchandise. This will happen oftentimes with like retailers or just, you know, companies that are maybe bringing products in and then just packaging them or assembling them together and then exporting. They're not using them in the US. Those can be eligible for an unused drawback claim. Another one is rejected merchandise. And this is where, you know, you might have defects or you might have parts of the product that didn't fully meet specs to be able to sell it. And rather than like shipping it back, which costs a lot of money, a lot of times companies will just factor that into their business operations and they'll just destroy it in the US. If you take certain steps, you know, including like certificates of destruction with customs, you can make a claim for the duties that were paid on that destroyed merchandise. And then another one is just substitution, which that one's kind of interesting. If you have like an inventory of a bunch of different products, and you're kind of using FIFO or LIFO or however you're accounting for the goods coming in and out, it doesn't necessarily have to be the specific good that you paid duties on that gets the drawback refund. You can actually substitute products that are still in your warehouse, but it's the same type of product as others that got exported. And as long as the HTS codes match up, you're able to claim drawback that way. That one's a little less common, but still an option. So timeframes for making a drawback claim, anything within the last 5 years of importation is eligible. So it's kind of nice. You can go back and, you know, several years and make a claim all at once to get a big chunk of duties. That works well for people that don't necessarily have a ton of annual duties expense on their books, but if you add it up over several years, it becomes meaningful. Different required documents are going to be, you know, import entry numbers, export documents, destruction certificates, bills of lading, invoices, you know, shipping documents, all that kind of stuff. The ACE system is with customs, and it's the electronic means whereby they ask you to make all the claims. And there's different privileges you can apply for with ACE. I'd say probably one of the most important ones is accelerated payment, which it takes some time to get into that, but once you make a claim to get on accelerated payment, it is a privilege that they have to grant you. But once you get that taken care of, then the drawback refund comes much more quickly after a claim, as opposed to if you're not on accelerated payment, it can take 6 months to a year. It can take quite a bit of time. So, and then bond requirements, some claims require bonds to kind of secure the refund process. Here's some, again, direct identification this is going to be where you actually specifically identify the products with like serial numbers, for example, that duties were paid on that were then subsequently exported. And then, like I mentioned before, substitution is another way you can do it, as long as the 8-digit HTS codes are are matching there. Here's a little bit more on accelerated payment. Once you get signed up for this, it can be within 30 days that you're getting your refund back. So very much recommend that. One of the things that CBP requires is solid, documentation that can be followed clearly. And this is really important because CBP agents at any time can review your claim. They can come in and check, kind of like an audit. They can check your records. They can make sure, okay, what were your HTS classifications that you used? Did they in fact come in? Were they in fact subsequently exported? Did you calculate the proper amount of duty that was paid on these items? So very important to have robust documentation there. And then retention, you have to keep all the records for 3 years after the liquidation of the drawback claim, which just means basically when they process it. And then some of the documents, like I mentioned, import, export records, bills of lading, certificates of destruction, are just some of the types that you're going to have. Some of the limits and restrictions here, you can't ever get money back for anti-dumping or countervailing duties and certain agricultural duties as well. And then, like I mentioned before, you can't exceed 99% on your refund. Certain excise taxes and fees are also excluded. And then I don't have a slide for this, but I do want to go over, when I'm done with my slides, just some of the specific new tariffs that some are eligible and some are not eligible for drawback. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Here's just a quick case study, just like a hypothetical example here. Let's say ABC Co. imports $500,000 worth of electronics in a year, and they pay $50,000 in duties on that. The first thing you'll want to do is calculate how much you exported. So let's say they exported 90% of those goods back out of the US to Japan. You would file a drawback claim using ACE within in this example, they did 3 years, but it can be up to 5 years. And then the result would be ABC gets 99% of the $50,000 that they paid in duties. As a refund, so $49,500. So again, this is it's something that you should consider if exporting is a big part of your business, because another method, another option, I guess, route to go would be foreign trade zones, and I'm sure you're familiar with those being on this webinar, because World Trade Center Utah is very, very good with foreign trade zones. But sometimes if foreign trade zone isn't going to work, or if it's too cumbersome to set up, or it just doesn't make sense for your business, then I think drawback is still another good option to consider. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick, and then I just wanted to go over some of the newer tariffs. And Ben talked about some of these, but there's the 10% universal tariff that went into effect back in April. That one is drawback eligible. Some country-specific reciprocal tariffs as well are drawback eligible. And then the Section 301 China tariffs, those have been in effect for quite a while now, back since like 2018. Those are eligible for drawback. And then Section 201 tariffs as well, which goes all the way back to the Trade Act of 1974. And then some of the ineligible tariffs, these might sound familiar to some of you. These are more recent, but these are ones that are not eligible for drawback. The 25% on automotive imports, 25% on goods, and 10% on energy products from Canada, not drawback eligible. 25% on goods from Mexico, 25% on aluminum from most countries is not drawback eligible. 25% on steel from most countries. And then the 20% on goods from China. That was amended up from 10% back in February. So those are some of the drawback ineligible. Again, just to reiterate, the eligible ones are going to be your 10% universal tariffs, country-specific reciprocal tariffs, and then Section 301 China tariffs and Section 201 tariffs. And with that, we can go to questions if there are any. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Duncan. That was really helpful. Does anyone have a question? Feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we can have Duncan or Ben take a look at it. While we wait, Duncan, if there's a way for folks to get a hold of you, do you want to share that info with us?
Yeah, sure. Let me just put my email in the chat here.
Great. And Ben, you mentioned something in the chat. I don't know if you want to highlight it now while we wait and see if we have any other questions come in.
Yeah, no problem. So I did a little research while Duncan was presenting and just looked at what the situation was with Mexico. And, you know, I shared two links, the executive order, which that had the language about, you know, goods in transit in that exemption. And then I shared the CSMS, the updated one, which was after the first set of dates were deferred and what that language was. It left silent the in transit exemption on the extension or the implementation in March, which was an extension from February, which means if that logic follows, it may not be eligible for the in transit exemption if they're not going to put that back in potentially. So it's something to keep an eye out for and is a really great question. Using the logic from Mexico, it may not be extended or the date may not be moved, but it's always a possibility because if there's one thing I found with these tariffs, as Duncan presented, some have drawbacks, some don't. Some have certain things, some don't. Some may have the CSMS and then, you know, not leave silent the in-transit exemption, and you just don't know until that specific language comes out.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben. Looks like we don't have any questions. Since Duncan shared how to get a hold of him, Ben, why don't you really quickly just let people know how to reach out to you or get to that the website.
Yeah, so our website was dropped in the chat. It's wtcutah.com/tariffs. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of the page, it's got the information that you can contact our team, whether it be for the foreign trade zone or for any business advisory services to help strategize what you may want to do as a company around tariffs. So, you know, our team was just looking at a case yesterday that we were hashing out about, you know, USMCA products and how to rethink, you know, where supply chains are coming from for a company. And so if that's the type of stuff that, you know, your company is really exploring right now, please reach out to our team and we're happy to have that conversation and see what that could look like.
Perfect. Looks like we don't have any questions, so we'll end a couple minutes early. Thank you to Ben and to Duncan and to everyone who joined us and submitted questions. As a reminder, there's another briefing next Friday at 9:30 a.m. So we hope you'll be able to join us as this is a very fluid conversation. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.